Welcome to the Veritas Forum, engaging university students and faculty in discussions about life's hardest questions and the relevance of Jesus Christ to all of life.
Thanks. It's great to be here. I really appreciate you bringing a little snow to make me feel at home. And we have quite a bit in Connecticut. And the topic for tonight is faith, reason, and the knowledge of God. And what I want to do is I want to talk about 4 points in particular. And I'll walk through these to try to clarify some issues about how to think better about the relationship between faith and reason as it pertains to questions related to God. So I'm not going to give, in particular, a case for the existence of God, though I'll talk about some of those things along the way. The question of the relationship between faith and reason is historically a vexed one. It can be tempting for us to think that it's only a contemporary question. It's something that only people in our own generation wrestled with. But this has been around as long as, in the Christian tradition, as long as the Christian tradition has been around. And one of the towering figures in Christian thought is Augustine of Hippo, and it was one of two of the major events that kept him from becoming a Christian throughout his early adult life. And when he finally resolved these questions and became a Christian, one of the first books he wrote was a little short work called On the Usefulness of Belief. So the question of wrestling with the relationship between faith and reason is a long one. It's one with a venerable history. And it became especially pertinent with the rise of, what philosophers call modern philosophy, with Descartes and the Enlightenment and the rise of the empiricists and the rationalists. These questions were given a special urgency. So I'm going to say 4 things about it. And the first one is that faith and reason do not have to conflict. It's possible to have religious faith in a way that does conflict with reason, but you don't have to. It's possible for them to work together. And again, Augustine is the hero here. He introduced a notion in the tradition called faith-seeking understanding. And he said, this is how we approach difficult questions. Faith-seeking understanding. And St. Anselm in the 10th century or the 11th century picked this up and articulated this as a good posture about the relationship between faith and reason. So what were they talking about? Faith-seeking understanding. Augustine thought that he knew things because of his faith. His faith was trusting in reliable authorities, and that brought, in some cases, knowledge. And he said, but if I have faith knowledge, I want to push past faith knowledge and also have understanding knowledge. So I apply my reason to the things that I know in virtue of my faith, and I try to work them out to see if I can also understand them. Sometimes you can make a lot of progress, he thought, and other times you don't make much progress, but you still know things based on faith. So let me give you some examples for how this can work in areas that aren't religious at all. So for most of my life, I had never been to England, but I knew a lot about England. I listened to the Beatles, and you know what happened on Sunday? It was the 50th anniversary of the Ed Sullivan Show. You remember that? How many of you remember the Beatles on Ed Sullivan? Right? I was 7, and I was too young to stay up that late. So my brothers got to watch the Beatles, but my parents made me go to bed. It's one of the dismal failures of my life. But anyway, I listened to the Beatles, right? I watched Mary Poppins and Peter Pan, and I knew things about England. I read about England. But everything I knew because I trusted that I was getting good information. I was trusting that the movies gave an accurate portrayal, and that Big Ben really is a big clock, that they weren't lying to me, that they were telling me the truth. That was a kind of faith knowledge, a knowledge by trusting in an authority or a set of authorities I took to be reliable. Well, then about 12 years ago or so, my wife and I got to go to England. It's the first time for me. It was wonderful. We got to walk through Oxford, and now I know by experience what England is like. I'm not just relying on what the reports of other people, but I know by my own experience what England is like. I know how smoky the pubs are, even in the afternoons, and how insane it is to drive on the other side of the street, and how beautiful the countryside is. And it made sense to us that New England in the United States is called New England because it had a lot of the same rolling green hills. And so my faith knowledge about England was turned into some kind of experience knowledge or understanding knowledge. Now, Augustine thought the same thing can happen with religious faith. So he would take a hard topic like, how can it be that God knows what you're going to do ahead of time and you're still free? And he says, I believe because the church and the scriptures teach that I'm free and that God knows what I'm going to do ahead of time. So I believe these things can work together, but let me try to work it out in my head. And so another one of his books is called On the Free Choice of the Will. And he really thinks he's solved the problem. Now, I don't think he solved the problem. I don't think a solution works, but he's demonstrating faith-seeking understanding. So faith and reason do not have to be in conflict. They can work together. A second point under this is a lot of times it's confusing to put faith and reason together because of the ambiguity of the English sentence, I believe in God. There's something deeply ambiguous about this. So I believe in George Washington. I believe George Washington existed. I even believe that he was president at one time. Right? So what does that mean when I say I believe in George Washington in that way? Well, it means I take certain things to be true about him. I think it's true that George Washington existed. But what about this? I believe in recycling. What do I mean when I say that? Well, it doesn't mean I believe recycling exists, although I do. It has to mean more than that. It doesn't even mean I believe recycling is a good thing, although I do. Right? I could tell you how good recycling is, but if I didn't practice it, you would say, oh, Gansel doesn't really believe in it. See, there's a difference between believing that something is true and believing in it like we believe in recycling, which involves some kind of a commitment. It orders my life in certain ways to believe in recycling. It demands a response. And the sentence, I believe in God, is ambiguous because it means, on the one hand, I believe that God exists, but it also means I have some kind of trust, or I orient my life, or it can mean this, it doesn't mean it for everybody, I orient my life around God and his purposes for me. And so you might ask the question, isn't it the case that religious believers have their faith but don't subject their faith to evidence or to reasons? And I think it works this way. The I believe that part of the story, I believe that certain things are true, that God is real, that's what gets subjected to evidence. And the I believe in God, meaning I trust God, is related to that, but it's not quite open to evidence in the same way. It's kind of like this. I believe in my wife. It's not just that I believe she exists, although she does, but I have confidence in her commitment to me. I have absolute trust in her. Now, you could probably argue that there's some percentage of a chance that my wife really doesn't love me. You might be able to bring a little bit of evidence to bear on that. But it would be very bad for me to then minimize my commitment to my wife according to the evidence. That's a bad marriage policy. right? I am committed to you 0.97% because there's a small bit of evidence, and possibly I'm being deceived about your commitment to me. You don't put that on a Valentine's Day card, okay? And so my confidence in the truth that she loves me is a ground for my commitment to her that might even exceed the evidence. And this is the way we are about most things in life. You sat in this chair when you came into the room. You had less than 100% certainty it would hold you, but you committed yourself to it. Right? And so clarifying the believe in and the believe that can help us sort out this question as well. So the first thing is faith is not opposed to reason. The second thing I want to talk about is you can't prove the existence of God. You might have heard people say this, right? You might have said it yourself. When people tell me you can't prove the existence of God, I like to say, you just met me. How do you know? Maybe I can, right? Right? And so, if you were to say that to someone, they're like, what are you talking about? It's become kind of a slogan. You can't prove the existence of God. I think there's something true and important about that sentence. But most people who say it think they're saying something important about God. I think what they're talking about that's important is not about God, but about proof. Because what most people mean when they say you cannot prove the existence of God is that you can't give me an argument that's so persuasive that it's going to persuade everybody. Or you can't show with 100% certainty that God exists. And of course that's true. I can't prove the existence of God that way. But what does that tell me about God? Not very much. What it tells me is that the question of God is like almost every other question in life. Because we only get 100% certainty kinds of proof in mathematics and logic. Every other academic discipline is evidential. There's strong evidence or weaker evidence. And the question of God is the same thing. It's a philosophical question that doesn't really lend itself to absolute certainty. But we look for evidence. Third thing, so we've got faith and reason do not have to conflict, and then we have you can't prove the existence of God. The third sentence I want to talk about is this one. No one is neutral about this question, about questions related to God. Now, maybe there's someone in the world that's neutral, who's never thought about it, but none of you are neutral, because you came to a lecture to talk about faith, reason, and the knowledge of God. See, sometimes it's easy to think that the posture of atheism or agnosticism is a neutral position. And just like we are physically situated in this room, you're all there in neutral territory, and I have to make a case for why belief in God is reasonable. But actually, each human being has got a philosophy of life or a worldview. You believe some things are true and other things are false. You might not be clear, you might still be working it out as we all are, but you have a situation, you have ideas about moral reality, if there is such a thing. Is there meaning in life? What are the best ways to know about the world? You have these hunches. You are not evaluating faith and reason from a neutral vantage point. So the question is not, is the evidence for God so overwhelming that it can move me from neutrality to belief in God? It's much more like a car advertising. Notice that a car ad never tries to persuade you to buy a car. They never say, you should buy a car. They assume you're going to buy a car. And then it's comparison shopping. They say the Toyota Corolla. It's much easier to parallel park than a cement mixer, and it's not as ugly as a Volvo, right? And you think, oh, I'm going to buy a Corolla, right? That's the way philosophies of life are. It's not, does Christian theism is it so strong that there are no challenges to it? Or is atheism wildly irrational, such that no sane person can believe it? No, it's which philosophy of life or worldview provides the broadest, the best explanations for the phenomena we encounter in life. So there is no neutral position. Okay, so here's where we're going. Faith and reason do not have to conflict. What does it mean that you can't prove the existence of God? And then there is no neutral position. And the fourth thing, I'm actually going to use technology, is how can we know anything at all about God? There are only two ways. I've got just a few slides. There are only two ways we could know anything about God. So let's suppose inside the circle is the natural world, the entire space-time universe, all of history. And then outside would be anything supernatural, if there is anything. There are only two ways we can know. So here we are, we're little bits inside the natural world. Some of us are wider. That was me right there. Picking up the pounds as I age. Right? So we're part of the natural world, and the first way we can know anything at all about God is we look around the world and make observations. We look at what we encounter, we study it, we think about it. And that includes looking at human nature and human cultures. And then we infer what might be true about God. This is what philosophy of religion is. People who argue, look, the existence of the universe makes more sense if it was made by an agent. The design of the universe, the fine-tuning, makes more sense if it was tuned by an intelligent mind. The moral nature of the universe, of every human culture, makes more sense if there is a moral grounding to the universe itself. These are the kinds of evidences that are often discussed. So we observe these things and we infer what might be true about God. But there's another way we could know about God, and that's what if God steps into the world and tells us stuff? Right? And so Christian theism tells us that both of these are good ways to get information about God. That God made the universe, and we can see evidences of God's existence and nature through what we observe, including what we observe about human nature. But God hasn't left us to only on the inference or speculation. God has actually entered history and revealed, told us stuff about himself. So we can learn about God's existence, God's power, God's goodness. There's evidences for these things. Now, I'm not explaining what they all are or defending them, but I'm explaining the faith reason part of it. And then God reveals himself, how to know God, what God's plan is, what the details of his will are. But there's no other way we're going to know anything about God. And Christian theism says both of these ways we can make progress. So let me try to make it a little bit personal. Not long after the Beatles were on Ed Sullivan, maybe 10 years later, when I was 16, I was starting to think. I was brought up in a home that was basically religious, but I had already decided it was completely irrelevant to anything I cared about. And I was starting to rethink questions about God when I was 16, and I had a stunning experience. I was in the shower, where I do most of my thinking, and the thought hit me in a flash: there was too much goodness in the world for it to be an accident. Now, years later, I realized that was a philosophical thought. At the time, I didn't know what philosophy was. It was just kind of a flash. And immediately I concluded God has to be real. And God has to be close. And this was actually a turning point in my life. This was one of the decisive moments in my journey to becoming a follower of Jesus. And it was just a few weeks later that other things began to make sense to me about God revealing his plan and what that has to do with Jesus, that I began to follow him. Now, that was 41 years ago. And it made sense to me at the time that the goodness I encountered required an explanation. It makes sense to me today. So what's crucial about the faith-reason question is that it is an academic question, but it's not only an academic question. The question of God is an academic question, but it's not only an academic question. It connects to every important question that we ask about what does it mean to be a human person in the world? How do we navigate? How do we learn? It connects to all of these things in an academic way, but also in a personal way. So, let me recap a few things. Faith and reason do not have to conflict. It's possible to operate under faith-seeking understanding. We trust reliable authorities, and then we try to work these things out and understand them, and faith and reason work together. You can't prove the existence of God. That means we're looking to weigh evidence. Is there a strong case, or a stronger or a weaker case for the existence of God and for God's nature? There's no neutrality. We are going to inhabit some philosophy of life or another. So we have to weigh Christian theism and any other alternative against our own current beliefs. And then the only way we're going to know about God is either through this inference, looking for evidences, or if God were to speak and reveal himself to us. So that's what I want you to think about. And then I'm going to have a seat, have a cup of coffee, and allow Troy to ask some questions. Thank you so much.
You see what I mean? There's not a lot to disagree with there. I want to recap what Greg just said. Faith and reason don't have to conflict, depending on how one understands what faith is. For instance, relying on something for which you don't have evidence yet that it's reliable, that's faith, then of course that's compatible with reason. If it weren't, there's a very, very fast argument that nothing is reasonable. We all rely on our senses. We rely on our brains, right? We rely on our brains, our nervous systems. How do you prove that your nervous system is reliable? Get it checked out at the doctor? Really? Going to go get an MRI and then what? The doctor tells you, your brain's working great. Right, but you have to use your brain in order to interpret the doctor. Right? How do you know that a doctor said your brain's okay? How do you know that's an MRI of your brain? You're going to use your brain. Oh, here's the puzzle. Try figuring out that your brain is working without using your brain. Not going to happen. You can only think using your brain. Okay? So if faith means relying on something you don't have non-circular evidence for, then faith is ubiquitous, it's unavoidable, in principle. Either we don't know anything, either nothing's rational, or faith is okay, in some sense of faith. Right? So number one, check, yes. Number two, can't prove the existence of God. Well, it's a bit of a shibboleth. Maybe you should read Anselm first before saying that, yes. But there's some truth. I mean, look, those of us who have looked at the proofs, by and large, think there aren't any proofs if proofs are things that command universal assent. We don't have that for God's existence or for God's non-existence. If we did, we wouldn't be having this discussion. We would be like, here's the proof. You know, we would just point. It would already exist, and we would point you to it. Like HTTP backslash. There's no point. So, right. But in reality, we decide questions all the time, not on the basis of proof, but on the basis of strength of evidence, which is itself a fuzzy notion, but it's the best we've got. Right. Check. No one is neutral. I don't know what the right thing to say. I want to say something stronger than check. Something like amen, I guess is appropriate in this setting, right? All of you lit, crit, anthro types, you should be down with this. There's no neutral starting point, as Heidegger says. We're thrown into the world, we're thrown into being with an identity, with a gender, with a nationality, with a racial identification, whatever. We're thrown with certain characteristics that shape the way we see the world, with a bunch of background beliefs, with family, with a body of a certain kind. There's no neutrality. There's no such thing as neutrality. The very notion of neutrality is incoherent. It's a fundamental lesson of epistemology. Check. Number 4, how can we know anything about God? Well, the natural world or the revealed world. Well, here maybe question mark. Let's say, if we can know anything about God, it'll come through the natural world or through revelation of some kind. That's a conditional. But it's really contentious that there is anything to know about God, because it's really contentious whether God exists. Mm-hmm. So I'm not going to just grant point 4. I think point 4 sort of presupposes, in the non-conditional form, presupposes that God exists. Okay, I want to step back from the 4 points, which in a way I want to say Greg just taught a great epistemology lesson to everyone, and it should frame how we think about religious belief. Because I think people put religious belief in a very, very different category than they put many, many other beliefs in their lives, and they shouldn't. I won't add, I think Greg said it as well as can be said. I do want to kind of try to frame things maybe, so maybe I'll have an easier time pushing him. First of all, if I'm to frame a thesis that Greg has, it seems to be, I'm just constructing this, that belief in God, and here God I take to be something like, we're assuming a definition of some kind. I'm just going to assume something like, since this is a Christian organization sponsoring it, the monotheistic God of the Christian tradition, or some likewise condition, the all-perfect creator of the universe, that sort of being. That sort of being, and a personal being of that sort, powerful enough to create the universe, responsible for the things that are around us, also a good being. It's reasonable to believe that such a being exists. I take it that's the thesis. It's not irrational to believe that. And I want to suggest that that thesis isn't, even though I just made it up, it's not quite formed correctly. Propositions are not reasonable or irrational or irrational per se. They're rational or irrational for individuals. So Greg talked about his wife and kids, and even though I knew Greg at Yale, I've never met his family. So I have a very different evidential basis than Greg does for various propositions about his family. Like, if I were to believe that your wife is tall, that would be irrational. Is your wife tall? I don't know. No, okay, she's short. Okay, so if I were to believe that Greg's wife is short, that would have been irrational. Now it's rational. I have testimony. Oh, I picked the wrong size.
Sorry.
But it would have been rational for Greg. So I just want to make a point. I think Greg will agree with it. If we're to frame a hypothesis that's worth discussing, we have to be clear about whether it's rational for anyone to believe that. For instance, that would be a hypothesis. It's non-ambiguous. It's rational for someone to believe that a Christian God exists. It's rational for everyone to believe that Christian God exists. It's rational for some people, but not necessarily all people, to believe that the Christian God exists. So I thought I would throw out that as a clarification. I'll let Greg take off. Okay, I'm done rambling. I'll ask a question. I thought the distinction between believing in and believing that was great. And it's true that it can explain some of the apparent conflict between faith and reason that really is just about an ambiguity in the word belief. Belief that has to be responsive to evidence, has to be calibrated. Belief in is a matter of trust and relationship. It's not amenable to degrees or responsiveness to evidence in the same way. It's kind of a category mistake. I wonder, Greg, what the relationship is between believing in and believing that. suppose there are people out here who don't believe that God exists because they just don't have either the psychological gumption, or they just don't think there's enough evidence, or for them, given their background, there isn't enough evidence. Is it possible for such a person who doesn't believe that God exists to believe in God? It's not that they believe that God doesn't exist. It's that, I don't believe that the number of stars is even. I don't believe that the number of stars is not even either, right? Is it possible for such a person who's in this state, neither believing that P nor believing that not P, to believe in God? And in particular, Kant talks about the attitude of hope. And hope seems to be an attitude that's subject to rational constraints, but of a different sort than belief. So you can hope. You can't really rationally hope that something you know is false is true. You can't hope that 2 + 2 = 5 doesn't. You can't even hope that, right? But you can hope for things that you don't know to be true. So anyway, the debate that apologists center their lives around belief that side of things. You've really helpfully noticed a division here between believing that and believing in. I wonder how far that division can be pushed, such that someone could be an agnostic in that they don't believe that God exists, but they have a hope in God's existence, and they're faithful to God, despite not even believing that God exists.
That's a great question. A couple of things. I don't think that's a normal position. There aren't very many people in that category. But I do believe it's possible. And I've talked to some philosophers who are really wrestling with the question of hope versus belief that. And I'm certainly not going to say that that can't happen. I think it's probably an unstable position in this sense, that if someone adopts a posture of hope and belief in God, it's going to be part of the path either to coming to believe that God exists, as this hope gets, the content of the hope gets verified in their experience and their evidence base shifts accordingly, or it'll be part of the process of coming to believe that God doesn't exist, as that evidence shift doesn't seem to be happening for them. So I think it's probably not a stable position, but by being unstable, I don't mean to be criticizing it. I just don't think someone's going to inhabit that position for long. On one more point on the relationship between believe in and believe that, these are connected to each other. So for most people, believing in God is, and trust in the trust sense, is also connected to evidence. But it's not responsive, as Troy said, in the sense that your belief in God or your trust does not have to be proportional to the evidence, because that's not the way trust works. Every week I get in my car and drive on Interstate 95 in Connecticut, and I know with 100% certainty that there's a chance I won't make it to my destination, because you see the wrecked cars. It's kind of like the National Geographic specials where the lions take out one gazelle and all the other gazelles are kind of slowing down to look, right? The crash cars are everywhere. You know you have a chance of crashing, but you cannot commit yourself to the car 92%, right? You're either in the car or you're not in the car. And there are many things in life that are like this. And I think that belief in God and trust in God can be like this. We can have it's not completely disconnected from evidence, or it doesn't have to be. But given a sense of reasonable confidence or moderate confidence that God exists, it's a reasonable thing for me then to commit myself and to order my life around what I think is right about God. But Troy's question is actually more interesting, which is the one about someone who finds herself simply without the belief that God exists. Is it a reasonable posture for that person to believe in God? And I'm going to say that's going to be unusual, but I think it can be reasonable for someone. One more small thing. I think Troy's right also that whether or not a belief is reasonable depends on the person and the situation. And this is why what my thesis, if I could probably construct one, which I don't know if I can, is not that belief in God is reasonable, but that it can be reasonable, which is a very small thesis, but at a school like Reed, that comes as news to lots of people, right? And I'm arguing for a minimal claim that belief in God can be reasonable, right? That doesn't mean it is for everybody. I also think atheism can be reasonable. So, more thoughts?
Okay, I have another question, which is, I think probably you'll have some. I don't want to hold up the good questions. I'll make this my last question, and we'll open it up to you all. I'm guessing we'll get more sparks from the audience than from me. Well, actually, I reserve the right to follow up this question.
Please do.
What do you think the strongest argument is for the existence of God?
That's a great question.
And then in my response, I want to take it down.
Yes. The argument I find most persuasive is a version of the traditional moral argument for the existence of God. And it's that I find it very difficult not to believe that there are real moral obligations that are binding on us. All right, so that's the datum from which I would construct an argument. And then the argument would simply be, if that's true, theism, the belief in a personal God with a moral nature that created the universe and created human beings, that makes more sense of that datum than atheism. So it goes kind of like this. If moral reality is the way that I think it is, and of course that's contentious, but I find it hard not to believe that, that wouldn't surprise us at all if God existed, because God is supposed to have a moral nature. So the fact that there are these moral obligations makes sense. It fits with the hypothesis that God exists. But the hypothesis that no God exists, it would be really surprising if there were moral obligations that are binding on us in the way that most traditional moral theories and practices seem to embody. I find that persuasive. I don't find it a proof, but I find it pretty persuasive to me. That might be it.
All right. I would like to engage that, but I think it'd be wiser to turn it over to all of you. I think I'd kind of like to call on people.
Okay, that would be great.
If that's okay, Greg?
We have two people that are going to hold the microphones.
So
so if you want to ask a question and Troy calls on you, make sure you are either standing at a microphone or one of the lovely assistants.
Well, we already have someone standing here, so why don't you start us off?
Yes.
So this is kind of a big question, but I was wondering how you would consider metaphysical, starting at the individual level, to be conclusive or useful in the discussion of God.
Okay, can I ask a clarifying question? Yeah. What do you mean metaphysical argument starting at the individual level? Are you thinking about the moral thing I just talked about?
Well, like, kind of my a personal metaphysical position I have is that authenticity of an individual is engaged in things for their own sake. That way that they're pretty much engaged with reality as it is to the extent that they can be.
Mm-hmm.
I would consider that to be a kind of mode of self-realization.
Right.
So I think that ties in with your moral argument, and I was wondering if you had any thoughts as to how we could elaborate that to a kind of like a parallel to natural world evidence for God.
Well, I think I think my moral argument is an example of this. So any argument for a philosophical conclusion starts with something you take to be likely. I think it's kind of like this, and what's the best explanation of this? Or Or what are the implications of this? And there are different ways to cash this out. I think that moral reality is a certain way. I think we have obligations. And then what is the best worldview or big, grand metaphysical story to account for that? Now, of course, there are a lot of stories. I'm just comparing two here, right? Theism and atheism. There are all kinds of other stories that will explain moral obligations either better or worse than these stories. But so I think what I'm doing is basically an example of that. And I affirm what you're saying, that what we want is to engage reality as openly as we can. So even though we can't be neutral, we can be open-minded. That doesn't mean it means we can question our own assumptions and this kind of thing. Is that kind of what you were thinking of?
Yeah, it was.
Okay.
I guess I was more wondering if there was like more of a distinction between, say, physical evidence and metaphysical evidence.
I think there is a distinction, but I don't think it's relevant. I mean, I think there's physical evidence for God's existence.
Well, yeah, I guess,
Yeah.
would you consider it to be more a revelation category or the inference category?
No, I'm on the inference side of that fence. Okay, well, we should let someone else.
Yeah, let's move on.
Thank you
Let's
very
go to
much.
this mic over here. Sorry.
Yes.
Wait, hold on just a second. We'll go over here.
Yeah.
Hi.
Yeah.
My question is about the difference between, I think the two things you have up there are reveal and infer. My thought is that revelations happen in the natural world, and then we infer based upon those revelations. So what is the difference between them? That's kind of the first part. And then second of all, there are different revelations that don't always agree. So, and then there are different interpretations of the exact same revelation. So how do you know which is right?
Okay, there are three things to your question. First of all, thank you. That's exactly right. So if there's a purported claim to revelation, that it becomes some piece of the natural world, and we have to figure out, is that claim substantial? Is that claim worthy of belief? You're absolutely right. So the claim that God has stepped into history and revealed himself to us then becomes something we've got to reason about. We don't just accept it like, oh, well, God said it. Then, you know, we've got to reason. We've got to reason about it. And that becomes especially acute when there are different, you might say, either incompatible or incongruent claims for revelation. And this gets into a very complicated type of thing. But you've put your finger exactly on the challenge. The point here is that if God is real, and Troy was right to press this, if God is real, then there is the possibility that God would reveal himself to us. And if we could have good reason to think that's the case, which comes through the inference side of the story, then we have another venue or avenue for getting information about God. I think is exactly right. So for Christian theism, a lot of Christians who've thought about this think a lot about the resurrection of Jesus, because it as opposed to like the virgin birth. We've got two miracle stories. The virgin birth is really hard to verify, even if you claimed it happened right here, right? It's like, how are you going to know, right? Now, I know you all might try to pull that card out, right? But the resurrection of Jesus, if is much easier for the people who claim to be eyewitnesses to verify. They would have known that. Now, there's a lot of work that has to be done in these things. The short answer that I think is, if Jesus wasn't raised from the dead, we wouldn't be talking about it now, because the Christian story would have died out, most likely. It's not a proof. But you're exactly right about claims of revelation. Now, do you want to follow up on that to clarify or complain?
I hate to say this, but I don't know if you really answered the question about the difference between revelation and inference.
Okay, well, let me try again. No, don't hate to say that. Thank you for saying that. any claim to revelation is something we have to reason about before we accept it as revelation. Okay? And so that puts those claims into the realm of the inference. So maybe there's no difference. But then the difference becomes this. If we decide it's reasonable to believe that's a revelation from God, then we have a new kind of source of information about God. It's not just what I can reason about human nature and the physical world, but I could learn, maybe God has a plan, and God wants me to embody certain virtues that I wouldn't have thought about if God hadn't said that, like loving my enemies, right? Nobody would have made that one up, I think. I wouldn't have made that one up. So the difference then is if the claim to revelation is something that you think is reasonable to believe, then you have another source of information, and then there's a difference. But adjudicating that, and Augustine, in his book on the usefulness of belief, talked about all of these things, right? Before you can have belief that the church and the scriptures are reliable, you've got to reason about whether or not they're reliable, or otherwise you won't accept them, right? And I think that's right. You put your finger on a very important point, which I left out for time, but thank you for raising it.
Can I ask
Thank you.
Yes.
very quick follow-up? Just clarificatory question.
Yep.
Was part of your response that the most probable explanation of the fact that we are currently talking about Jesus is that he was resurrected from the dead?
Yes.
That's okay.
Yeah, I think that I think that's true. No,
That seems-
that's
all
kind
right,
of a bald.
Yeah, I mean,
Bold
well,
claim.
it doesn't strike me as obvious.
No, it's not. It's not obvious. I don't think it's obvious, but I think it gives good grounds. I think most historians who study it agree that Jesus got himself killed historically and managed to get himself worshipped, and then you've got to weigh various alternatives. It becomes a very complicated thing.
I think this is a good case where what's rational for people to believe differs depending on your background assumptions.
Oh, I
for
think
me,
that's right.
resurrection is really implausible, so that these other explanations are more probable explanations of the fact that we're now talking about Jesus. Like, for instance, people who had something to gain from acting as if he were still around when he wasn't. Whereas if you already antecedently believe in the resurrection, then you think, well, that's a plausible explanation.
Right.
And I guess I've adopted a bit of a sneering tone. I'm living
No,
up to the Dawkins
No, you're not. You're not at all.
mission that I meant to say.
Yeah.
No, I don't mean to say that. I
No,
really
no,
mean
you're-
it seems to me relative to your background beliefs. But if you just think it's highly, highly implausible that anyone ever was resurrected after 3 days, then you would automatically give that hypothesis that's why we're talking about Jesus a very low probability.
That's right. That's right.
Whereas if you're like, well, of course it's not just Jesus, it's Lazarus, and it's not even a one-off event in the universe. Then it's the center of your entire life. Then you wouldn't think that's an implausible explanation.
Right. No, I do think you're right. Right. So I was kind of doing autobiography when I said that, and some of it has to do with when you're investigating a question like the resurrection of Jesus. It seems like you want to bracket your conviction that miracles are impossible. Right. I'm not saying you have this conviction, but a lot of people have a conviction that miracles are impossible, because clearly if God doesn't exist, the Christian interpretation of the resurrection of Jesus is going to be false. And so if we can be agnostic about God's existence and therefore the possibility of miracles, then I think if God exists, then it's not radically implausible.
Right. So I think
Yeah.
this is a great point about the difficulty of neutrality or the impossibility
Yes.
of neutrality.
Yes.
If I'm to be neutral, I can't assume that miracles are impossible, because after all, that's up for grabs.
Right.
So I can't assume that resurrection's like super implausible or improbable, because I would be begging the question against Greg.
Yeah. But I can't. I
see the
can't
problem.
also
You
make
also-
the argument based on, well, since God exists, then we know Jesus.
There was
raised.
resurrection is is possible because it
It's
happened.
actual. Which would be valid, but circular.
Valid but circular, exactly.
You know, every circular argument is valid. Just, for your logic students.
Okay, I'm sorry to have hijacked things.
We're having too much fun.
Yeah, Catherine.
Yeah.
So you stated that one of what you think is the best sort of argument for God is the moral argument. And so what I'm wondering is the problem of evil really a problem in your argument? And what do you think is the best argument to deal with the problem of evil?
Great question. So probably the most popular and most powerful argument against any version of theism is the problem of evil. If God is supposed to be so strong and so good, why is there evil? And it's a very complicated question, so I'm not going to do it justice here. I think my conviction is that God has reasons to allow evil, both evil in general and particular evils. In general, I don't know what they are, right? In any particular case, I don't know what God's reasons are for allowing particular evils. It would be hubris of me to claim otherwise, and I think it would be annoying to claim otherwise. I think when you begin to bring in Christian theism, which has more resources to explain the problem of evil, we have some other considerations. So, for example, if there was no evil in the world, we would know Christianity was false. In fact, if there was no really deep, significant, horrible evil in the world, we would know it was false. Because it's a story of redemption that cost God himself dearly for our redemption. So the Christian story requires significant depths of evil. Now, I don't think that engages every aspect of the problem of evil, but I think that the Christian story has resources to bear on it. And I realize, unless we talk for 40 more minutes, anywhere I stop is going to be unsatisfying, but it's a super important question. It's one of the things, one of my friends in grad school wrote his dissertation on the problem of evil, and he edited a book, and he said that between 1962 and 1992, there were over 4,000 philosophical pieces published on the problem of evil. So clearly, we're still wrestling with this. And I think we always will. I think it's part of the human existence. I think it's the most emotionally powerful argument against the existence of God. I think it's probably philosophically the strongest argument against the existence of God, especially versions of the evidential problem from evil. I think bringing in the resources of Christian theism rather than just generic theism brings a little more to bear on the subject. So if you think I evaded the question, you might be right. We might be able to follow up on it. But.
Good.
Yeah.
Yeah, over here.
Yeah, this is just a point of clarification. I'm curious where your belief in universal moral obligations comes from, because it's not intuitively obvious to me.
Well, I didn't say universal. I think there are real moral obligations. I'm not sure that the content of morality is universal. I think there are disagreements about the content of morality, but across cultures, but actually not as much as you think, right? And a good little introductory book on this is C.S. Lewis's book, The Abolition of Man, where in the appendix, he draws together moral codes from Confucianism and all of these different places to show, look, these things aren't exactly the same, but they generally cut up the world in similar ways. So there might be more shared moral sense. But what I was arguing for was, I think there are real moral obligations, right? So for example, if you overhear two people having a moral discussion, not a theoretical one like whether capitalism is inherently immoral or something like this, but let's say the first person is accusing the second person of doing something wrong. Look, when you did this, you did something wrong. Here's something you never hear. Oh, but I'm not playing the moral game. And then the first person says, oh, I'm sorry, I thought you were. Okay, I'll drop it. Right? No, we take great pains to show that we had reasons for what we did that justified us. And even though we live in a culture where especially students claim to be moral relativists, we are more moralistic than any other generation that's ever lived. Everything is a moral issue. Right? So in your paper today, I picked up your paper, there was an issue about sexual assault. Well, we have deep convictions that that's objectively wrong. It should not happen. People who think it's, it's okay are mistaken. They believe something false about moral permission. I mean, so what I'm doing here is I'm trying to tug at intuitions that I believe are more broadly shared than is generally admitted. But I just can't see the world other ways. I just don't imagine what it would be like to be a human being if there weren't moral obligations. But thank you.
Okay, let's go over here and then to you.
So this got asked a little earlier, kind of as a part B to a question, then it got lost. If you're given a piece of evidence in the natural world from which you then infer the existence of a God, how do you know what God it's evidence for? Because there are multiple religions that will all purport to explain the same phenomena. Is it entirely subjective?
Excellent question. I think think about a crime is committed, right? We watch a lot of detective shows on TV like Castle, right? Or if we want something really dark, we watch Psych, right? And so there's a body on the floor, right? And then the detectives show up, well, not on Psych because they just screw around, but on a real detective show. The detective comes in and picks up a bunch of stuff and examines it. And some of that stuff is going to turn out to be evidence, and some of it won't be. Some of it's irrelevant. And of course, on a TV show, at the beginning, the evidence points in one direction, but that's the first 15 minutes, and then eventually it points to the other direction. And different lines of evidence work together to conclude, first of all, this was not a natural death. Someone helped this person into death, and to try to identify the killer. Okay, so my point is that there are different lines of evidence, and we're looking for a cumulative case. And it might be, first of all, that our first conclusion is that the physical world is not all there is. There's something supernatural, or maybe there's something moral that is not reducible to particles and energy and mass. And then we find other points of evidence. And another piece might say, well, if you combine that conclusion with the fact that the existence of the universe itself is surprising if there's no God, more surprising than not, yet it makes sense if there's a God, then you begin to kind of close down the options, and I'm not sure you're going to close them all the way, right? It's going to be reasonable for people to disagree all the way along the line, but it's not subjective, because if God exists or not, and if God exists, under that, what God is like, those are all objective facts about reality, whichever way it goes. And we may never come to agreement, but the fact of the matter is going to be something objective. And we just keep kind of working at it and thinking, well, it seems this is the best I can come up with at this point. Is that helpful, or do you want to follow up?
Yeah. I guess what I was getting at was kind of, if you're given, say, the existence of the universe, that is
Right.
improbable. I guess I'll just make sure that I understand what you're saying. Then you're saying, maybe there's, Christianity explains this, Judaism explains this, Hindu, and
Right.
most any religion explains the existence of the universe. Then you kind of have to rely on other lines of evidence and your personal background to decide what you believe.
Yes. Your personal background is what is going to make some lines of evidence seem stronger or weaker to you. But there are certain pieces of evidence that are not going to differentiate between, for example, different concepts of God. So if you think, look, the universe had to be caused to exist, let's say you come to that conclusion, that's not going to help you sort out whether Christianity is true or deism, which is the view that there is a God who set the whole thing in motion but doesn't care that much about it and just kind of doesn't intervene, right? Both of those are going to explain that piece of evidence equally well. So you're going to need a different line, just like you said, to close down.
We're sort of out of time, and I'm afraid we're going to have to take one more question. I'm going to leave you hanging, Enrique. So just so I can say this now while I still have your attention, there's some refreshments upstairs in the Volume Lounge. For those of you who aren't from Reed, it's out these stairs and out this door and up the stairs. That way, yeah. Also, I just want to, I'm supposed to remind people to turn in their comment cards. Okay, I wanted to get that out of the way. One last question.
Yes.
Hey, so as a Christian, what are your views on other religions that have parts that are completely conflicting with parts of the things that you believe in your religion? How
Right.
would you claim that those things are false in your worldview, or would you say that they can both kind of coexist, that they're just different aspects of the same truth?
Well, I mean, this is a problem for everybody, not just religious believers. In fact, religious, like as a Christian, I have more things to affirm about other religions than if you're an atheist, right? Because I think they have more truths in them than atheists think they have truths in terms of like God creating the world, or even if it's not a theistic religion, that the spiritual realm is deeply important for human flourishing on some cases of Hinduism or something like this. But I do believe that if two beliefs are literally contradictory, they both can't be true. Now, I would say you believe that too, probably, right? Because we believe contradictions can't be true. Here's why you want to believe that, and I don't know you, so I don't know where you're coming from. But if contradictions could be true, then you couldn't argue against the existence of God. Because the best arguments are, look, if God exists, and let's say evil, there seems to be a contradiction, I could just say, well, God can make contradictions true. Contradictions can be true, so a contradiction doesn't count against the existence of God. In order to have any rational argumentation about anything, we have to assume that contradictions can't be true. So I think almost everybody believes, if they believe P, that stands for some sentence, and someone else denies P, that person has to be mistaken, right? They believe something false. Is that helpful? Or do you want to follow up is a better question?
No, yeah, I guess that is helpful, but does that mean that you exclusively believe that your religion is more true than the other religions in this world?
Sure.
Or do you kind of like...
Aren't you some kind of cultural chauvinist?
Oh, yeah.
Let me put it that way.
I hope not. I mean,
Look, you grew up Christian, right?
yeah, I pretty much grew up
and then you
Christian.
just so happen to believe Christianity.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is this coincidence?
Well, I don't know if it's a
I
coincidence.
mean, but you think all the other religions are false because you believe in logic, and you believe in
they're not
Christianity.
false about
and then
everything.
Where-
It's only where there's contradiction.
Where there's contradiction, and you believe atheists are wrong too.
Right.
Absolutely right. All the religions agree that atheism is false.
Right. And all the atheists believe that all the religious people
I shouldn't say. I mean, there are atheists, whatever.
Yeah.
I mean, Unitarian.
Yeah.
There's versions of Buddhism. Yeah. I'm putting this. I'm putting words in your mouth. I'm not asking this question on my behalf. I've just, I hear it a lot.
Yeah.
Why isn't the mere fact that you hold those beliefs and that you come from the culture where those beliefs are dominant, equivalent to, I don't know, isn't it jingoism? Isn't it just like, I'm an American, why isn't it just a cultural, isn't it cultural arrogance?
Well, I think the short answer is it doesn't have to be. Now, beliefs are not arrogant, people are arrogant. Okay? Now, so I could be arrogant, right? I try not to be. But if I'm arrogant, it's not because I hold a certain belief. It's because of the way I treat people. right? Or if I'm closed-minded, it's not because of what belief I have, it's because how I hold those beliefs, and I'm unwilling to allow other kinds of beliefs to question mine. Now, if there's really no neutral ground, then on this question, we're all in the same boat. Everyone believes certain things are probably true, therefore you believe the opposites are probably false. And if I hold one of those opposite beliefs, you think I'm mistaken. Now, on the chauvinism question, we live in a time where I think there's a great cultural fallacy. And the fallacy is, if I am going to be inclusive of other people, I have to be a relativist. I can't think that they're mistaken about their beliefs. I think relativism is what's arrogant. And it goes this way. So suppose there's a friend of mine who's a Muslim, and he says to me, Allah is God and Muhammad's the final prophet. And I say, well, you know, we really aren't disagreeing. I'm not showing him any respect, right? What we want is cultures of affirmation, appreciation, and respect. And the way to get there, I believe, is through understanding that we actually disagree about important questions. But it's okay that we disagree. It doesn't mean we can't be friends and we don't treat each other well, right? And this is why I say beliefs aren't arrogant, people are arrogant. And does that make sense? I mean, I just dropped a big thing here.
I think that's great, Greg.
Yeah.
I want to remind everybody, it's just perfect. I don't want you to add a word to it. I want to remind everybody, I think there are discussion tables upstairs if people want to keep talking about this stuff. I think we modeled a pretty respectful debate here. For those of you who think Reed College is a bastion of atheism, well, it is, but that doesn't mean that we're not interested in the same thing that theists are interested in, which is the truth. I think we've been really lucky to have Greg Gansel with us. Let's give him a round of applause. Thank you.
For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at veritas.org.